babies have perfect spirits. They know truth. They inherently understand it and they love it. But their parents hold some degree of denial. And that causes conflict with the child because the child desperately wants to be real and needs to be real. And the horrible rub is that his parents desperately need him to be just like they are. And for a little child, this is torture because it goes totally against what all his instincts are telling him to do, which is to be 100% real and honest, 100% connected with his spirit. So right away, he comes into conflict with his parents and their needs, their unresolved emotional needs, their need to lie. So the result of this is that every child that comes into the world has to go through this transitional conflict of giving up parts of himself in order to fit into his family system, in order to fit into the world and the needs of his parents. And this is traumatizing for a child. And traumatizing in 100% of the meaning of the word trauma. It's emotionally overwhelming. It's totally intense. It's full of horror and misery and terrible, terrible pain. I often am very alone in expressing this idea that little kids go through emotional trauma just by fitting into the denial of their family system, because this traumatizing process is so incredibly common that it's the norm, it's ubiquitous, everybody goes through it, so that in our society, it's not even considered a problem. Or another way to say it is it's the pink elephant in the living room, that all little kids are going through emotional trauma in their families, but it's so common that nobody wants to say it. What it means is, first, that people shouldn't be having children until they've totally worked out their inner issues, until they've totally worked out their denial, so they're not forcing the child to squeeze into their little box of denial. The second thing that it means is that parents themselves have to look at what happened to them. They have to look at their own history and see that what they are doing to their children and have done to their children is exactly what was done to them. And that means that they have to look at their own history of trauma, and they have to get in touch with their own internal pain that's been split off for decades. They have to look at the horrible things that their parents did to them. And this entails breaking their idealization of their parents to whatever degree they idealize their parents. This entails looking at their childhood and really seeing the denial that was everywhere in their family. And it also entails looking at themselves as adolescents and as adults and seeing how much denial they were and are still in. And to be blunt, who wants to do that? Well, if someone has a desperation to get real and a desperation to be their true self and to totally connect with who they really are, then they do want to do that. But if part of them wants to live for comfort, if part of them wants to live an easier emotional life, if part of them wants to just feel good and happy most of the time, if part of them wants to be loved by the norm, be loved by their parents, be loved by conventional friends, be loved by their conventional spouses and partners, then they don't want to look at it. And here's a fascinating point, that the process of a child being traumatized, emotionally traumatized, being forced into denial, being forced to go through horrible, painful experiences, is exactly what an adult needs to go through in order to work out his traumas, just in the other direction. So being traumatized is like swallowing poison. It burns your mouth, it burns your throat, and it burns your stomach. But if you can learn how to take that poison and put it into some split-off part of yourself, it doesn't hurt anymore. Now, the process of emotional healing and of bringing those traumas up, of looking at your denial and of resolving it, of figuring out how to work it out and becoming an honest person, that's the exact opposite process. That's taking the poison out of the split off comfortable parts of yourself, bringing it right back into your gut and vomiting it up. And it's terribly painful. It's exactly the same pain that the child went through once upon a time. So the intensity with which people resist looking at their traumas and resist healing them goes to show exactly how painful the traumatizing process was in the first place. Extreme examples qualify here perfectly. Alcoholics, why are they in denial? Because it's terribly painful not to be in denial. Now, the pain that an alcoholic has to go through to really understand why he became an alcoholic and why he has stayed an alcoholic for so many years, that pain tells exactly the horror he went through once upon a time, because it's the exact same pain. It's the unresolved pain of childhood trauma. Now, that's an extreme example, but for all of us, it's true. Breaking our denial is terribly painful. And how much easier to just say, I'm not in denial. I don't have any problems. Lots and lots and lots of people say that. Normally in day-to-day life, we don't address child abuse. We don't address painful life experiences of childhood. How many biographies skip right over people's entire childhood? Or if they talk about their childhood, they just paint it in idyllic and rosy terms about how wonderful the childhood was. Maybe spend 5 or 10 pages on the idyllic nature of childhood, and then move right into adulthood, as if childhood never even happened. Well, that's how most people live their conscious lives. They really don't have any connection with their deep and painful childhood experiences, and as a result of that, they really don't know themselves at all. It is amazing to see how addicted people are to their comfort, how their comfort is more important to them than almost anything else in the whole world. Why deep down do they prefer comfort more than truth? Why do they prefer comfort more than growth? And the reason I've observed is that growth is terrifying. Letting go of comfort is just terrifying. It's like swimming into the ocean far above your head where there's no ground to stand on, and we don't know what's going to happen, and we might get swept out to sea. That's the terror. But below that, to let go of comfort is to enter the horror of the child's fears, to go back into the little child that we were, who was abandoned and neglected and actually hated by the parents, and to feel that child's horror and terror and pain. And people, of course, could argue, oh, well, very few children actually go through horror and terror and pain. I myself never went through that kind of horror and terror and pain, but my observation is actually they did go through that horror and terror and pain. They just have totally blocked it out of their consciousness. If people really could relate to their own child within, their own childhood experience, they would certainly get why they like comfort. And when people actually do look within and really are able to look deep, deep down into their troubled sides, get into their more unconscious sides and their split off horror, they can see why they have their problems, their addictions, their desperation to cling to comfort, to cling to relationships that even aren't healthy relationships at all, to cling to that addictive quality of, I need to be with this other person so desperately, or to look at why they really had children. I've asked a lot of people, why did you really want to have children? And most people give facile surface answers. I wanted to have children because I love children, or I wanted them because I wanted them, or it just happened, or that's what we're supposed to do, or that's biologically healthy. But the deeper reasons are they want children to plug up something in their own life, something that's missing, and often to put a plug in the hole that their pain and their horror might escape through. Then there are all the other addictions, people who are alcoholics and drug addicts. They're desperately striving to keep themselves living in a comfortable realm so they can avoid the horror that's within them. No one who is a drug addict or alcoholic or addict of any sort would have those kind of problems unless they had a massive amount of pain and torment from their past that they were trying desperately to push aside. Other addictions too work perfectly. I've seen gambling addicts. What are they really gambling with? What they're really trying to gamble is how long they can keep their pain and their horror and their inner torment at bay. Society actually encourages people to have mild addictions. And actually, if you're a mildly addicted person and it doesn't manage to destroy your functioning, then society doesn't even consider that an addiction, even though I say it's a mild addiction, that's from society's perspective. From my perspective, it's actually a severe addiction. And that is the goal of the norm, to have addictions that keep you comfortable and addictions that are societally acceptable. The people who have 1 or 2 or 3 glasses of wine every night at dinner, the people who smoke a little bit of pot here and there, keep their pain at bay, people who have children and don't really nurture their children in the way the children need, but they create a family that looks very healthy and looks very happy and conventional, and the children are well dressed and go to school and do what they're supposed to do. These people, these low-level alcoholics, low-level drug addicts, average parents, people in average relationships, they're all addicts, desperately striving to keep their comfort in order. What happens if they drop their comfort, which is the prerequisite for growth? What if they start to make sacrifices of the things that are comfortable for them? That opens the door to their pain and their horror, and it is terrifying. I could give a perfect example of a way to drop one's comfort for value, to drop one's comfort for the sake of personal growth. My example is making this video right now. The horror that I've been going through making these videos, the anxiety that I've gone through, the things that I can project are, people are going to hate this. People are going to write me off as crazy. People are going to say, oh, he's so immature. He's just trying to work out his own issues externally. He's trying to convince people of things that are ludicrous. And the thoughts that come in my mind when I actually turn the camera off, the embarrassment, the who's going to watch this, who's going to think that I'm bonkers and, find ways to write me off as crazy. Yet why am I doing this? I'm doing this for the sake of sharing something of value, something that can possibly change the world. Will everybody listen to this? Absolutely not. Might some people out there listen to this? I sure hope so. That's my goal. And also, it's good for me because I believe there's a great value in manifesting my true self at whatever the cost. And for me, the cost has been great. Mostly the main cost that I've had is an incredible amount of anxiety about becoming real and being real, because it doesn't win friends. Or actually, that's the funny thing. It actually wins real friends, but there's very few people in the world who really have the capacity to be real friends because so few people are even interested in this stuff. Their whole purpose in life is to avoid this stuff and to keep their painful material far, far away from consciousness. So I would guess that the average person who is watching this video right now, if they really want to avoid their pain entirely, they would have turned this off a long time ago and watched something else. There's certainly no lack of things on YouTube to watch that can help keep you comfortable. And yet, I feel a need to do this anyway, both for myself and for the world. I'm fighting for me, for myself to manifest truth and honesty at whatever the cost. It certainly is easier to fit in if you're average and have the same addictions as everyone else and aren't criticizing everyone else's addictions and criticizing their behavior that they don't even consider addictions. And that actually is an irony. You take the average severe alcoholic who's getting totally drunk and blacking out and doing crazy things and getting in fights and falling down and smashing themselves up and having terrible hangovers in the morning and having sex with strangers constantly. That severe alcoholic, if you tell them, you know, you're a real alcoholic, their response many, many times, and I've experienced this, is absolutely no, I'm not. I drink a little bit once in a while, but I can totally control it. How dare you call me an alcoholic? And they generally don't want to be friends with me after I say that, don't want to be my therapy patient after I say that, because you're breaking their denial. Well, the irony is that even with very mild addicts, they have the exact same reaction. It's a lot easier for a mild addict to write someone off who's breaking their denial, who's challenging their denial, because they have all of society behind them. What happens if you tell someone, you shouldn't be having children? You're in a very disturbed relationship, when that's not their perspective at all. Their perspective is, I'm in a really good relationship and I'm really happy now and everything is good and I can't wait to have kids. People don't like to be challenged like that. They're going to be very resentful. So, a consequence of getting real, the torment of breaking comfort, breaking denial, is a lot of isolation, a lot of social stigma, a lot of social marginalization and alienation, being labeled as a pariah, potentially being labeled as mentally ill. And people have a wonderful way, even professionals have a wonderful way of taking things that they don't find comfortable and pathologizing it. For instance, if I went to a therapist and described, you know, I'm right now I just have all these really excited ideas and I feel this vital passion that I need to share them, and it's at a great cost to me and there's a lot of consequences for this that people respond negatively. Yeah, I have some allies, but mostly it's just a lot of negative reaction. They can say, oh, he's bipolar. He's in a hypomanic episode right now, and they can give me a coded number, whatever bipolar is, 296.4, and they can give me a diagnosis. And that sounds like an interesting hypothetical, but that's what my family said about me. They believed that, some of them at least, believed that I was bipolar. That's, for me, one example of a cost of having gotten more honest and gotten more real. I was trained to lie. Lying was a survival tactic. I had to. It was like I would get eaten alive. I wouldn't get loved by my parents if I didn't lie and pretend and say what they wanted to hear. So I became a master at that. And when I did that, the consequence was I was loved much more. I was society's darling, the family's darling. And yet it didn't satisfy my soul. And that's been my deep motivation for getting real and getting honest. Because my attitude now is, whatever the cost is, it can't be as bad as the cost of being fake. The problem was when I was fake and hiding and saying the right thing and playing the game and wearing the right clothes and having the right haircut and spouting the right philosophy, which I was good at. I was good at all those things, and I was given enough of these, quote, gifts to be able to do that, that I wasn't happy. At some profound, deep level in my soul, I knew there was something very wrong what I was doing and who I was. Not a real person, a fake person. And I still feel to some degree I am, and to survive in the world a lot I have to be to some degree a fake person. I could say part of it's maybe a good survival tactic now. I'm not, committing suicide by honesty, but at the same time, as I get stronger, I have more of my true self to lean on. I have a center to hold on to that allows me to say what I want and say what I believe with much less anxiety than it would have cost me in my past. In the past, the anxiety would have been so bad that I couldn't have even considered the possibility of saying this stuff. Now, I can say it. Still is very anxiety producing for me, but I'm also predicting that in the future, as I get stronger and work out more of my traumas and have more of a true connection and a deep and honest connection with the core of my true self, that this will be much easier. But in the meantime, it's okay, because the purpose of life is not to be comfortable. It's not to be happy in the short term. It's to get real and to grow. basic way that I do self-therapy is by journaling. I write in my journal every day, and I write down exactly what I'm feeling. I write down what I'm going through. I write down my experiences, usually of the previous day, but sometimes of 10, 20, 30 years past in my life, and I analyze them. I try to make sense of what I'm going through. I try to make sense of my present feelings and my present experiences in light of my past experiences. I try to connect my past to my present. But it's also a way of being incredibly honest with myself. I first started writing in my journal when I was 17 years old. And I went there because I felt so alone. I was desperate. I didn't really have anybody that I trusted to share my internal world with. My family wasn't safe. I didn't have any friends that I could be so intimate with, and I most certainly didn't trust therapists. I had gone to a psychologist once when I was 13, against my will. And it was a horrible experience. I felt totally pressured into it. I felt alienated, and I felt that I was being bullied and threatened. So I turned to myself, and I started writing in my journal. And it was terrifying. I was so afraid that someone in my family would see it and discover my inner world. And I couldn't bear that thought. So what I did is I took my journal, it's a black journal that I had, a big black journal, and I drilled a hole in it with a drill press. And I put a combination lock on it. That allowed me to feel safe. Right away, I started finding myself able to write about what I was feeling. And it was limited at first. I could maybe write a page or two at most, maybe a paragraph just about my feelings. It was terrifying to know that this internal world was going on. I had this belief back at that time that I was fully healed. And so writing in my journal, writing honestly about what I was going through, strongly contradicted that. And it created a lot of cognitive dissonance where I had to acknowledge that there were sides of me that were very unhealed. And that was frightening. But it was also liberating because it gave me a sense of hope. Now it's not so terrifying to write about my feelings. But on the other hand, when I get into really fresh feelings that are new, that are hard to acknowledge, the split off and dissociated sides of myself, it actually is terrifying still. It's sometimes embarrassing, and I have this feeling sometimes that someone's looking over my shoulder and reading it. And in a way, what I've discovered is that someone is looking over my shoulder and reading it. It's all the voices in my head that were implanted by my parents and my ancestors, all the voices that said, you shouldn't do this is wrong, you're sick, you're betraying the whole family system by writing about this stuff, by even thinking it. Your job, Daniel, is to split it off and keep it split off and think that you're fine and think that we're all fine and don't look at this stuff, just keep away from it. There is massive betrayal in writing in my journal, but it's been giving me my liberation steadily for the past 20 years. So I write in it every day now. Pretty much I remember my dreams every night. I shouldn't say I remember my dreams, I remember some of my dreams. I think we actually all dream a lot more than we remember. I know people who say, oh, I don't dream at all. And what I've come to realize is, yes, they dream just like everyone else, but they're just so split off from themselves that they don't remember their dreams at all. And I can understand why, because becoming unsplit off, becoming reconnected with yourself is a terrifying process. And it's more than getting a cup of cold water thrown in your face. It's actually like sticking your finger in an electric socket. It's terrifying, and it overwhelms the business as usual sort of life that most of us live. It's such a vulnerability-inducing process. Sometimes it's embarrassing. My dreams aren't always pleasant. I don't do things that are very nice in my dreams sometimes. And things happen to me in my dreams sometimes that are that are ugly or weird or strange. There's terror, there's violence, there's sexual acting out, there's paranoia. And I think these things are part of most of us, these unpleasant, ugly sides of human reality. What they are is our split-off trauma. And most people totally underestimate how traumatized they are. Most people, I think, underestimate how traumatized they are to such a degree that they don't even realize that they're traumatized at all. They think they're fine. And it's just not the case. I think most people are incredibly traumatized. Now, of course, in our society, the conception of a traumatized person is someone who's gone through the most utterly, unbelievably horrible experiences. For instance, someone whose family was murdered in Rwanda, or someone who was raped, or someone who was terribly sexually abused as a child, or violently beaten up or mugged many times. These are the traumatized people. But in reality, yes, these are the traumatized people, but these are the top extreme 1% of traumatized people. The other 99% of humanity remains incredibly traumatized. It's easy to underestimate how traumatized people are. They seem so healthy, but the reality is the norm is so incredibly unhealthy that if you look at life from the perspective of the norm, it all seems okay because it's normal. One thing that I've experienced as the result of my self-therapeutic process is that more and more I side with the child within me. I don't look at life from the perspective of the norm, and especially I don't look at life from the perspective of the norm being healthy. I look at life through the eyes of the child that I was and the needs of that little child, and also from the massive neglect that that little child suffered. Now, I know many people still who knew me when I was a child, who knew my parents and knew my family, and can't understand when I say I was traumatized. It doesn't make sense to them because it seemed like I had such a nice, wonderful, beautiful childhood. Loving mother, loving father, two-parent household, stability, parents with enough money to pay for all the things I needed, a good school, got good grades, had nice friends. But that's the surface view. From the view of the emotional needs of my inner child, there was massive deprivation. There was massive wounding. I wasn't really getting my deep emotional needs met. And that was traumatizing to me. And what I've come to realize in looking at the world and looking at other people from the perspective of the child's needs, that I am not alone in that. Basically, everybody I've ever seen is totally traumatized from their childhood from not having gotten their needs met. And the reason they're able to deny it is because they have no empathy for what their child's needs were, because they've split it off. It's too dangerous to really empathize with your little child's needs because that betrays your parents. And from a little child's perspective, betraying your parents is like death. It means you're going to get totally rejected. You can't betray your parents as a child. It's completely impossible. That's why even in the extreme cases, abused children side with their traumatizers. Now, most people grow up and break away from their parents, get some distance from their parents, and then are able to see their parents in a more honestly critical light, in a more legitimately realistic light. And they're able to see more of the reality of their parents' flaws and their parents' strengths. Though I should be really careful saying that because I know so many people as adults who have little or no ability to see their parents' flaws. Or they think they see their parents' flaws, and they think they see their parents' flaws in a realistic light, but at best they see maybe 5% of their parents' flaws because it's still far too painful to see the full reality of how limited their parents were. because to see how limited their parents were is to really acknowledge how traumatized they were, how traumatized they are, and how totally vulnerable they remain on the inside. When we get into our dreams, we get into who we really are, into our wounds, into our traumas, into our rage, into our frustrations with our parents and our life and our childhood and all the limitations that life has presented us with. But what makes dreams odd is that they're totally symbolic. So that's what makes it easy for so many people to say, dreams don't mean anything. They're just like little random workings of my mind. They're just something that I ignore. Yeah, I had a bad day today, and so I had some weird dreams tonight. Or, I had some indigestion during the night. I had really bad gas and that gave me bad dreams. Or I had a headache and that gave me bad dreams. And it's like, if only life were so easy. If only dreams really meant so little. Other people discount their dreams by saying, oh, my dreams are magical in terms of telling the future. They tell weird things about what's going to happen in the world. And that's an easy, mystical, quote, spiritual way to discount the deep emotional reality of your dreams. Analyzing dreams is not always easy. It's a lot of work, and sometimes there's a lot of guesswork and speculation. But that can totally fuel the self-therapeutic process, because just the act of questioning, of saying, what does this dream mean, of trying desperately to figure it out, even when there may not be a lot of clues, that in and of itself is valuable, because it starts the ball rolling of looking inward, of picking yourself apart in a healthy way and trying to figure out what's going on. And often if we go really deep inside ourselves and self-reflect, and ask ourselves, what does this dream mean? And let our mind quiet down. Often we find the answer bubbles up. So, even though my dream work is imperfect and confusing sometimes, and I don't feel I exactly get what the dreams mean, and by the way, dreams can mean so many different things at once. One dream can mean 10 different things. That maybe I get 2 of those things or 3 of those things. But over time, what I've found is that I've gotten much better at figuring out what my dreams mean. And often I get them pretty quickly, or get much more of them. Now, of course, I'm still improving on the dream analysis process. And it's like a muscle. It's something that the more you exercise that muscle, the stronger it gets. And no wonder then that people who have very little experience looking within feel very alienated when it comes to analyzing their dreams. They really can't make much sense of it. But again, like all things, if you try and you practice at it, you get better. Analyzing my dreams helps bring me back into my center, into who I really am, what's really going on in my unconscious. And it gives me a wonderful sense of connectedness and a sense of deep, real comfort and satisfaction, and that what's going on in my head is not crazy, that it really is legitimate, that I really was wounded, and that I really am struggling to work things out. Because what are dreams, after all? They're a desperate attempt for our unconscious to try to work out our problems. Problems that seem too overwhelming to us because we live in a world that's so against healing. And so our dreams are trying to do the work for us. And we do ourselves a great service if we try to actually help our unconscious, and we use our conscious mind to try to connect with that unconscious, and we work in tandem with it. I've already talked about it a little bit, because journaling and dream analysis are both forms of self-reflection. But in the broader sense, it's just any way of looking within, of asking ourselves, who are we really? What are we doing with our lives? What's going on in here and in here? And what I found with self-reflection is when I simply just try to self-reflect, I actually get answers. And often I believe this with other people too, because I've observed it, that If we have the courage to just ask ourselves the questions, often the answers come pretty quickly, because I think desperately our unconscious wants to give us the answer. Our unconscious desperately wants us to heal and wants us to become the full, true, manifested person that we were all meant to be. What is the goal of self-therapy? If the goal of psychotherapy is to become free enough to learn how to do self-therapy, I believe the goal of self-therapy, again, is to fully manifest our truth, to dissolve our unconscious. Because I believe a fully healthy person would no longer have an unconscious. They wouldn't need one. What is the point of the unconscious? The point of the unconscious is to help us keep all our painful material out of sight so we can actually function day to day. If the unconscious came up too quickly, it would overwhelm us. It could drive us crazy. It could make us have anxiety that would be totally, totally overwhelming. So we need to respect it, to be gentle with ourselves. That's why some people flip out when they try certain hallucinogenic drugs, even marijuana. It takes their unconscious and it brings it up into their consciousness far too quickly. And it's very, very disrespectful to the self. And it's not a gentle process. And that's the vital thing for self-therapy, to be gentle about it, to be self-loving. Because the whole problem with the traumatizing process of having a neglectful childhood, which is the standard, that's the norm, is that neglectful process that we've all gone through was so disrespectful to our inner beings. So many people today live extremely unhealthy lifestyles. And that actually works to the advantage of keeping your traumas split off. But if you really need to connect with those traumas, feel their pain and be able to grieve them and resolve them, living a healthy lifestyle does a wonderful service. So what does a healthy lifestyle mean? Well, of course, all the other things that I've mentioned so far are part of it, such as journaling and self-reflecting and analyzing dreams. But there are many simple tools for doing it. Simple for me to say, much harder to put into practice. But let me give a list. Getting a good night's sleep every night, going to bed at a reasonable hour, getting a good long night's sleep, and waking up in the morning when the sun's up. Eating a healthy diet, having good healthy food in the body, putting good nutrition into yourself. We can avoid drugs and alcohol. We live in a society where it's so common to drink alcohol. It's considered perfectly normal. But what is the purpose of alcohol? The purpose of alcohol is to keep us split off from ourselves, to allow ourselves to believe that we're happy without actually doing the inner work. Avoiding that. Ooh, it can bring up a lot of frustration. It can bring up social alienation. It can bring up internal pain. But sometimes that's just what we need for self-therapy. Being single. That's actually not so easy. Being single, being celibate. Not going out and having sex, not projecting your ancient unmet childhood needs through the sexual lens onto someone else and hoping that person's going to rescue you. That's the reality of what most sex is and what most relationships are. So if we can avoid that, we do ourselves a really wonderful turn in our self-therapy process, because it brings us back in connection with who we really are and what our real needs are. This is a risky one to say, but I think it's very, very important. Taking distance from one's family of origin, getting away from your parents, sometimes your siblings too. Now, that can be very painful for people. But again, often it's vitally important, because if you're so close to the people who did the basic wounding of you, who are the ones who basically traumatized you, it's very hard to understand what they did, because you're too close to it. Sometimes we need a lot of distance to gain the perspective, to really understand what happened to us and who we really are. When we're really, really close to the people who traumatized us, often we see things through their eyes. When we take distance, and sometimes a lot of distance, we gain the perspective to see who we are as individuals, what our traumas really are, what our wounds were, what our neglects were. And this is vital for self-therapy. It's like focusing the camera. It allows us to really see in crystal color where we came from and where we're going. Having good friends, strong allies. Now, the reality is, in our world where the norm, the 99.99% of norm, is very dissociated, there really aren't very many wonderful allies out there, but there are some. And if we really work hard and really go out and look for good friends and look for good allies, there are people out there who can support us, who can understand what we're going through. It's not easy. The problem is, sometimes gaining really new friends who really love us for the reality of who we truly are, that entails letting go of old friends, people who really weren't so supportive, but were our primary allies in life. And it can be very damaging to a healing process to have one's closest allies not really be supportive of one's self-therapy process. The last tool for self-therapy that pops into my mind is having fun. Going out and having a good time, enjoying life, seeing the beauty of what life has to offer, because self-therapy so much of the time is just a painful, unpleasant process. So we need to balance it out with some enjoyment, going out for an occasional good meal, having a good walk in the park, looking at flowers, smelling the roses, spending time with people that, again, really care about us, and doing it in a lighthearted way. Playing music, listening to music, maybe even watching some good television, watching a good movie. I'm now going to explore the 4 stages of psychological development on the path to emotional healthiness, from the least evolved to the most evolved. The 4 stages are dissociation, then depression, then grieving, then enlightenment. I'm going to define each of the 4 as I go along, but I'll start with the least evolved one, which is dissociation. And I'm going to talk about some of the ironies of these different stages. Dissociation is being split off from your traumas. Now, in the more conventional psychological sense, dissociation talks about being severely cut off from severe traumas. That is dissociation, but that's extreme dissociation. The most extreme being what was previously referred to as multiple personality disorder, where a person is so disassociated from parts of themselves that when they do access those parts of themselves, it's a completely different personality that's actually like separated by a wall from other parts of them. That's the theory behind it. And multiple personality is now known as dissociative identity disorder. Certain identities actually disassociate. When I refer to dissociation, I just mean being split off from your traumas, split off from whole parts of your own experience, split off from your pain, split off from your misery, and also, consequently, split off from a lot of your healthiness and a lot of your joy and your life force. But the irony is that people who are dissociated often seem fairly healthy, and they seem fairly normal because they are fairly normal. Because that's what normal in our society is. We live in a very dissociated society. We live in a society that's very split off from its rage, from its feelings, from its sadness, from its misery, from its suffering, and also from its incredible potential and its joy. Now, one could say we live in a society where we perpetrate terrible wars on other people in the world. We have horrible poverty. We treat gay people terribly. We treat homeless people terribly. We treat certain minorities terribly, we treat women terribly. All true. These are all signs of dissociation, because this is where individuals collectively express their dissociated, hated, suffering parts. And people who are dissociated split off their rage onto their children, and they act it out in that way. In my conception of the 4 stages on the path to becoming really healthy, being dissociated is just downright primitive. It's someone who has been traumatized, who's really not even aware of it, and is really, really out of touch. So much so that they can think they're doing great. The irony here is that the person who is at the most primitive stage of psychological development can believe that they're actually at the most mature stage. And our dissociated world often agrees with them, totally mixing up healthiness with being split off from your feelings, which is why I say that dissociation mimics enlightenment. The next stage up is when people actually take a psychological step forward. They step out of dissociation into suffering. The wall that's splitting themselves off from their horrible traumas, their wounds, and all that misery and rot and anger and frustration and depression, the wall breaks open and it's like a giant infection comes bursting out. And what does it come out into? It comes into depression, hopelessness, misery, suffering. The pain is not so dissociated. It's there, but it's just stagnant. It's rotting. It feels terrible, and it's miserable. Interestingly, what I learned over a period of time is it's when people are in the phase of suffering, that's when they come to therapy. That's when they say, I'm in pain, I need help, do something to help me. And what's fascinating about the psychology field is the average conventional part of the psychology field says, we will help you. We're going to help you do what we've learned how to do. We're going to help you learn how to devolve into dissociation. And so many psychology methods, and especially psychiatric medications and then electroshock therapy, all these different things, they take people from suffering and they bring them, the ideal is to bring them the relief of dissociation, because dissociation actually feels a lot better. They teach people how to split off their miserable sides. They take their brain chemicals and adjust them through the medication and through the other methods that they have. And I think hypnosis actually can often do that too. Actually, oddly enough, to get someone hypnotized, they have to get into a sort of a dissociated state. And I think part of it's teaching them how to stay there. Now, a lot of people decide to become therapists and psychiatrists once they themselves have mastered the art of learning how to dissociate, and they want to help other people do the same thing. Do all therapists do that? Definitely not. Do most therapists do that? Help people learn how to dissociate better? I think my experience shows me that yes, most do that. Do all psychiatrists do it? No, I think a very, very far majority of them do. That's why they prescribe medication, because medication does not help people evolve. There's no doubt about that. It can help people function better, but often people who are very dissociated do function much better than people who are very depressed, people who are in a lot of suffering. The next stage up in evolution is grieving. That's when you take the depression, take the misery, take the suffering, and take the horror, and make it purposeful. Actually do something useful with it. So the second stage of suffering and depression, it's purposeless misery. To take it for a purpose and do something with it is to begin to actually grieve. That's to make sense of it, to understand, where did this come from? Why is it happening? Why did I become this way? Who am I? Why am I feeling all this horror? Not just wallowing in misery. It's like one is wallowing in a dirty diaper, one is cleaning yourself up. How does somebody grieve? How does somebody do that? The work of self-therapy is to actually learn how to grieve. And grieving is actually resolving traumas. Being dissociated is not dealing with your traumas at all and splitting them off. Suffering and depression is actually feeling the horror of your misery but not knowing what in the hell to do with it. Then grieving is actually making use of it. It's working through the loss, working through the pain, understanding what happened, learning to love yourself and love your core of truth in spite of the horror of what you've gone through, learning that you're not your traumas. You're not the miserable things that you were taught in your childhood that you are. Now, some people could say, oh, my childhood never taught me that I have anything bad about me. I was just taught in my childhood that I'm a good, wonderful person. Well, chances are, if you really fully believe that, and you haven't done any grieving, chances are you're still very dissociated. And I say that also from personal experience, having at a point in my life been very, very dissociated. I came out of my family when I was 18 years old and went off to college, pretty damn dissociated. And it burst open into misery and depression and has gone much more into grieving. I would still say a lot of me is still in a grieving phase, and I have been for a long time. I think I have a lot of grieving ahead of me, but I think there's different parts of our personalities that can be in different phases at different times. Part of me is still dissociated. Part of me is still pretty depressed and suffering and miserable, and part of me is grieving. To talk a little bit more about grieving, really understanding what the loss is. What was lost? Because when you get traumatized as a child, you really do lose something. And parts of yourself can be stripped away, and sometimes you can't always get it back. You definitely can't have your childhood back. You can never be 4 years old again. But I think part of it's also grieving the fantasy of what you wanted. Grieving the fantasy that you had a good family and a perfect family. Grieving the fantasy that you were fully loved by your mother. That's a painful fantasy to grieve. And in my experience, in grieving myself and watching a lot of people grieve, it's torment. And it goes on for a long time. There's a lot of tears. There's a lot of anger. People often don't think of anger as being part of grief, but I see it. Anger is very much part of the grieving stage. Interestingly, one definition of depression and suffering, the second stage, is having your anger turned inward. So a lot of times people who are hopeless and suffering and depressed, they just hate themselves. When they're grieving, the anger starts actually being put onto the actual people who did the damage to you. And that's the key. It's not to act out the anger, but to find out who really did the damage. And it's not necessarily openly expressing the anger toward the people. Maybe the people who damaged you have been dead for 30 or 40 years. That's quite possible. How do you get angry at people that are dead? Actually, it's quite possible to get angry with people who are long since dead. Get angry at your parents who may be 80 years old now and they damaged you when they were 30. Very possible to get, and healthy actually, to get very angry at them. It's just how you express it is the key. But part of the grieving is feeling the anger, and the key is to feel it and own it. Own that it's there and know that it's healthy and know that it's appropriate, not to act it out. In New York City, it's not an uncommon thing to see people screaming at taxi drivers and yelling at bicyclists and yelling at other pedestrians and people having road rage and screaming and fighting over parking spots. They're not grieving. They're acting out their anger. If they looked inside and saw what was really causing them to be angry, it would guarantee it's not the cab driver driving up Fifth Avenue. It's someone a long, long time ago who did them a lot of harm. And actually, by yelling at the cab driver and yelling at a bicyclist and yelling at another pedestrian, that's a convenient way to let your traumatizers off the hook and to not have to really be angry at the person who deserves the anger. Then there's the most evolved stage, and that I call enlightenment. Some of the psychologists call it self-actualization. I could say it's knowing yourself, really being true to yourself, or a better definition was being fully connected to the core of truth that's within us all. If a person's conscious mind is connected to their core of truth in their heart, they are enlightened. And to me also, to be fully enlightened is to be fully 100% consciously connected with our core of truth within. And actually, I would define it as no longer having an unconscious mind. There's no longer that unconscious process working in the background because there's no longer any need for it. I think the unconscious mind was created and developed as the result of trauma. It was too painful to consciously be aware of the horrors that were going on in one's childhood. So what we had to do was create a separate part of our mind that was out of consciousness to be able to deal with all those horrors. And that conscious mind lives on until we resolve our traumas. So the ideal of humanity is to be fully conscious, to be fully enlightened, to have no more traumas within us, to fully know who we are within. Have I achieved that yet? No. So why do I have the nerve then to say I believe it's possible for someone to become fully enlightened? The reason is because part of me has attained it. Part of me has worked through these stages. Part of me has become much, much, much more enlightened more conscious, more aware, and less traumatized than I ever was. And that whole process, for every part of me that's become enlightened, self-actualized, conscious, healthy, has gone through those stages. It started with dissociation and has gone through to enlightenment. With one exception. There are parts of me that were never traumatized, and those parts of me never had to go through the whole process. There were parts of me that were conscious from when I was very, very young, because my parents and other people who were powerful in my life never damaged them. And the more that each of us starts off healthy and starts off conscious and aware, the easier of a life we have. The reason that people become fixated on trying to kill themselves is because they're hopeless. They desperately want to get real, but they don't know how. They desperately want to get real, but it's far, far too terrifying. They want to tell the truth desperately, but the pain of telling the truth is even worse than the pain of staying stuck in horror and misery. So they're totally trapped. So they think, there's one option that bypasses staying miserable, and it bypasses the pain and horror of getting real. And that option is killing yourself, just totally obliterating your own life and giving up. And yeah, it might hurt a little bit to kill yourself, but in their mind, it's an easy way out. It's a way that solves all the pain, solves all the struggle, solves all the horror, and just puts an end to it and says, I give up. First of all, it just goes to show how horribly wounded they once were, how miserably rotten of a childhood they really had, and how much terrible buried pain there is. Because if their childhood wasn't so rotten, if they weren't such a miserable, miserable person deep inside, it wouldn't be that painful to heal their traumas. It wouldn't be that painful to look in the mirror and begin to be honest with oneself and begin to really grieve the terrible damage. People that become suicidal are usually totally stuck in the very systems that created their traumas and created their misery. They're usually very stuck with their parents in various ways, even if they're not physically close with their parents or geographically close. Emotionally, they still are. Their parents still live very much in their heads, and rebelling against that is terrifying to them and painful and horrible, so they can't do it. That's why they stay stuck in so much misery. That's why they're so depressed. And that's why they become suicidal. The answer is trying like hell to figure out how to heal. Figuring how to make it easier to heal so that the pain is not so impossible to deal with. So that suicide doesn't seem like an easier option than going through the pain of healing. Because no one who is really healing, no one who is really grieving, is suicidal. When they're grieving, they're working out the traumas. They're letting go of the pressure and the misery and the horror. But how do you grieve? How do you take these steps? Well, that's the whole work of self-therapy. That's how you get your hope back.